Susan vote. We have a little note from Brandon Traster on the back of our bulletin. He's continuing his program of training Cap Shelby, Mississippi. Here's an outstanding notice. Jack Agnew is tentatively planning to participate in a defeat of fascism celebration in Russia. Many of you have heard Jack. He's talked here times. He's an outstanding. He's from the 101st Airborne, I believe. So he's going to. We're going to try to get him on a program after he comes back from Russia. I ask you to consider looking at the item called tax deductible donations to the World War II Lecture Series Institute. We're embarrassed at times to ask you for donations, but that's the only way we can keep moving. So those of you that might be inclined financially and philosophically, we're asking that you consider giving a monthly donation that would simplify our problem of obtaining money and simplify yours of making it easy for you to do that. Well, looks as though we're ready. You sure? Oh, you did? Well, we'll start the meeting with a pledge. John Bader is going to lead us to the pledge to the flag. John? Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, John. Instead of a regular invocation, I'm going to read a poem called My Choices. It's one that I've read to many people in nursing homes, and I think some of my friends from MARP have heard this at least once. But this is a time of the year when I think most about this poem. It's called My Choices, and it's written by Michael Dabina. I don't want to live forever. Neither do I want to die at a time when life is pleasant and I have no need to cry. I would like the Lord to call me when I'm lonely, old, and gray, and I suffer from some ailment that grows greater every day. But dear Lord, I beg your patience, not to call me into spring or into summertime of splendors, when the world of nature sings. I would choose you call me in winter, when the world is bleak and cold, and the earth denies me the comforts from the chills of being old. It's by Michael Dabina. You know, I've read a lot of poetry in the last 10 years, and it's interesting for me to note that women are writing most of the spiritual poetry. And here comes Michael Dabina, who is just, I think, an outstanding writer. And there's a little PS that was sent to me by one of my friends. We correspond on cryptograms. Here's what he suggested I add. A friend hears the song in my heart and sings it to me when my memory fails. Think about it the next time you visit a relative or a friend or a veteran suffering from either dementia or Alzheimer's. A friend hears the song in my heart and sings it to me when my memory fails. If you haven't picked up a copy of this bulletin, it has a listing of all the, not all of them, most of the World War II books that are contained in the Abington Library here. So pick up a copy and use it. That's what we're here for. Our speaker today is Ralph Bud Galow. I think today is the first time I've noted that his name is Ralph. I've called him Bud. I met Bud as a member of the Navy League up at Willow Grove, and I have come to know him very well as a tour guide at the Air Museum at Willow Grove Naval Air Station. Bud's going to tell us about some very interesting experiences he personally had on the battleship Tennessee. In fact, he's wearing his Tennessee t-shirt, and that's BB-43. You're going to tell us what that BB, that doesn't mean a BB, right? It means something else. BB-43. So while we're not completely ready, Bud's ready to start, and he's going to tell us about the battleship Tennessee. Bud?
If I turn this on, does it work? Yes, it does. Aha. All right. Yes, it is. My whole presentation depended on whether or not we're going to have a PowerPoint presentation for you, because I had a lot of visuals. And as of last Wednesday, we had some problems with the computer, which went down, and my philosophy has been to leave it to the teenagers, because they can figure out all these technical things a whole lot better than we can. And Hank is in the process right now of getting us up and running. But to preface who I am and where I came from, I grew up in the Poconos in a little farm out about halfway between Wilkes-Barre and Hazleton, out near Cunningham Valley. And when I was 17, I joined the Navy because everybody said you're going to be drafted anyhow. So my father had been in World War I and had frightened me with all of his stories about how bad the living conditions were in the dirt and the no beans and being in the forest in France and in Belgium. I said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to join the Navy. And that's what I did. I did boot camp up at Sampson, and when I got up to Sampson, I was the usual country bumpkin, and my bunkmate, who was a smart little Irish lad from Manhattan, said, "Stick with me, Galow, I'll take care of you." So we were friends from that time on. We went through boots. We went to Bainbridge, Maryland to go to radio school. We were shipped on the same draft to the West Coast, and from Treasure Island we went to the Hawaiian Islands, and from the Hawaiian Islands we went down to Anticook, where we saw that this huge ship was over there, and that's where we wound up. So we both wound up on the Tennessee together as radio operators, and it was a long friendship with a bunch of great guys on the ship. So that was my early life. After the war, I came home and went to work driving a lumber truck. And after about 6 months of that, I decided that this was work. And I had a chance to go to school on the GI Bill, so I came to Philadelphia, went to the Philadelphia Wireless Technical Institute to get a radio broadcast license. And after that, I got the license. You get a first-class license. Once you got the license, you're supposed to get a job at a radio station. But on the back of the license, you have to have an endorsement by the last man that you worked for, who was the chief engineer. And if you don't have a job, you can't get somebody to sign it, so now you are. Catch-22. You have a license that you can't get a job with because it hasn't been endorsed. I went back to Wilkes-Barre, and the chief engineer at WBRE said, I'll put you to work, but I can't hire you, and if you do what you're supposed to be able to do, I'll endorse your license. And so I worked 6 months for free, and then I got a call in to Charlie Sikorsky, who was the chief engineer. He said, I got you a job in Dover, Delaware. I said, wow. He said, you go down there and start to work. I went down and started to work in Dover, Delaware in 1950 at a fast $32.50 a week. After that, I convinced my girlfriend to come to Dover. She got a job at Sears, and between the two of us, we made $65 a week, and we got married. And eventually, I wound up at KYW, where I worked for 40 years. And if any of you were longtime listeners of the KYW News Radio, you'd heard him say, my engineer is Bud Galow. That's me. So that's where I come from. That's who I am. And I'm pleased that you're allowing me to speak a little bit about the ship. Tennessee was originally, the keel was laid down in 1914. Then the war came along and things stopped off. But eventually the ship was commissioned and put into service in 1921. And during the war, the post-war years after World War I, the Tennessee, which was a Tennessee-class ship, and the California, which was its sister ship, were the first ships built after the big conference on how much armament or how much weight or could be used. It was the Jutland Convention that decided this for the navies of the world. So she had 14 inches of armor plating around the waterline and a 14-inch armored deck, so it was pretty well protected. The main batteries also had 14 inches around them, but they only had 3/8 of an inch on the top of the turrets. I'm going to pass around here a photograph. That's the Tennessee when it was first commissioned, and this photograph is the commissioning crew. The ship was built in Brooklyn, and it went down the East River in June of 21. After its initial training period on in the Atlantic, it was sent to the Pacific and became a Pacific Fleet ship. They were in Long Beach, and from there, they did all of their summer training and exercises that they had themselves involved in, because the Navy didn't have enough money and funds to go into large programs. So the crew, we're still working here. Anyhow, the crews of the World War, or the pre-war Navy had to do a lot of training, and they had competitions and things that they did to keep them busy. I had a letter from one man who was Charlie Ewell. He wrote and told me how he got into the Navy. He was a graduate of Pacific College and couldn't get a job, and so he enlisted in the Navy. And out of all of the enlistees in the Navy, there was 2 that were taken, and this was in 1935. So you couldn't just go join the military to get a job. They weren't taking anybody in. He told me stories about how there'd be signs on the streets, dogs and sailors keep out. And I understand that was the same kind of a signage that you saw down in Norfolk, Virginia, although I'd never been there. But it was dogs and sailors keep out. So we had a baseball team on board that played semi-pro baseball. One of the pitchers was drafted by the Detroit Tigers. We had a basketball team, and if we get the program up, I can show you these slides. A basketball team in 1928, 1929 that beat everybody on the West Coast, colleges or semi-pro. There was the rowing team, the rifle team, the pistol team, a cutter team. Cutters were big whale boats. And in 1934, the Tennessee won what they called the Iron Man Trophy. That means out of all the competitions of all the battleships and all the cruisers, and there were very few aircraft carriers in the 30s, but they were the best. And had a big party, and even to this day, we have our reunions that I go to. Every year we have an Iron Man, and that's the oldest guy who was at the reunion. And the last guy who got it was 94 years old, and he said, "I never thought I was going to win this," but he did. And I was thinking now that I'm getting close to those. I might be one of those guys considered pretty soon, because we like to have the older guys there. I started running the reunions for the ship in 1984, and that's now, 21 years, a long time. When I first started, I had a mailing list of about 1,800 people, and now I just checked it today, and it's down to 435. That's what's happening to us. We're all in the same boat. We're going away rather rapidly now. And it's kind of sad to see your friends go. When the war came along, the Tennessee and the California and the Pennsylvania, the Maryland, the Oklahoma, the Arizona, and the West Virginia were all tied up at Pearl Harbor, at Fort Island. And I asked two of the men who were there at the time, how come the Tennessee was tied up at the quay and outboard on the port side was the West Virginia? And he said they'd been out firing 2 days before, and the admiral wanted to observe the Tennessee's accuracy in its main battery's firing, so he had transferred over to the West Virginia. So when they came back in on the 6th, the Tennessee tied up to the quay, and the West Virginia ties up outboard of the Tennessee. And I asked him, well, why did it do that? And he said, the admiral doesn't have to go across 2 decks to go someplace. He can just go off the outboard ship, and away he goes. So they didn't take time to transfer him back to the Tennessee, which is where he belonged. And that's why the West Virginia was sunk right straight down in the mud and wedged the Tennessee against the quay at Pearl Harbor. The Oklahoma was in front of the West Virginia. It was open all the way down to the double bottoms. Everything was wide open because they were up for their annual yearly stem to stern inspection. And you could just see what would happen when you get 3 torpedoes in the side. It just filled up with water and rolled over. I think they said it was only 8 minutes. So that was how that happened. And then there was an interesting thing. We had a Captain McFall who was on the ship, and I was talking to him one time. I said, how did you get on the ship? Well, I said, I was on the Oklahoma, and I was only a seaman, but I crawled out through one of the gun barrels because I was in the main battery. The gun barrel was sticking above the water, and those barrels are 14 inches. And he was skinny enough to get out of there. And then he came over to the Tennessee, stayed in the Navy, and stayed in for 25, and he was retired as a full captain, gunnery captain. But Pearl Harbor was that way. I just wish I had those pictures up. I had some photos. This is a photo of 4 guys who were Pearl Harbor survivors. Kelly was a Marine who was back on the quarterdeck just about to raise the flag when Pearl Harbor began. Bishop was a gunner in the turret. Butterball Richards was another gunner in the number 1 turret. And Harry here was, the last guy was the turret captain of the number 3 turret. So they were telling me all about what happened. Pass this around. This picture was taken a couple years ago down in Nashville at our reunion when NBC wanted to do a story on Pearl Harbor survivors, and they came to us and said, when was your next reunion? Did you have some Pearl Harbor survivors? And I set it all up, and the newsman Bob Faw, who came down, did the show, interviewed these people. It took about a whole afternoon, and it wound up on the Tom Brokaw News. It was 3.5 minutes, but it was it was an afternoon of interviews. But Richards was telling us how the day after they went out with the longboats to pick bodies out of the water and all this, and how it was. He said, you know, the stench was so incredible, and they, pardon me, ladies, he said, when they pulled the hand, the skin would come off. It was just a terrible situation for those guys, but they did it, and they cleaned everything up. When the Arizona blew up, and all of the oil came out and all the fire and everything, it blew the whole front end off. That was right behind this was here, and the Tennessee stern was there, that close. They were, you know, maybe 20 feet apart. Somebody on the Tennessee was in the bridge decided to make preparations to get underway, and there was a guy down in the after steering room decided to do the same thing. So between the two of them, the lieutenant commander on the bridge and an ensign down, they both decided at the same time they were going to try to get underway, which was stupid because they were pinned inside. So what happened, after a few minutes, somebody said, okay, let's try to make turns for 12 knots, making the propellers turn so they would go 12 knots, which was very slow, really. The lieutenant commander on the bridge said, make turns for 12 knots and let's get underway. And the quartermaster said, we're not moving, sir. And Tom Esterbrook, who told me this, said, we weren't moving. We were sitting dead still because the West Virginia had gone down and pinched the Tennessee in there, and 12 knots wasn't going to do anything. The only thing it did, it kept the fire from going down Battleship Row. The decks of the stern of the Tennessee and all the plates were buckled and the paint off. Who was it? One of them told me about going down afterward to clean off the paint that was on the deck in the officers' quarters. All the officers' quarters were in the stern of the ship, and they each had their own cabins, and their whites were turned brown. The paint was off the bulkheads, and it was all 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch thick on the deck to clean it all up because it was that hot. So you can decide, you can tell how hot that oil fire must have been. Anyhow, they were able to blow out the quays without damaging the ship, and the Maryland got out, and the Tennessee got out, and the California was not able to go. It was the Pennsylvania and the Maryland, and the Tennessee, they all left the 20th of December, 1945. And they went back in 1941. Pardon me, and they went back to the Tennessee and the Maryland went back to Bremerton, Washington, and the Pennsylvania went to Alameda for repairs. After the repairs were completed, they went back out, did some more tours. They did a few other things, which changed the topside configuration of the ship. And then the next operation that the ship was in was to be a deterrent during the Battle of Midway. They thought that if the Japanese got through Midway, they could come right through the West Coast, so they had two battleships and cruisers and destroyers that were just going around in a circle between the United States and Hawaii as a deterrent. They came back to the States, and then they went back and did some more work. And the first combat operation that the ship got into was up in Alaska. The guys were telling me that when they got up there, it was cold and foggy, and it was so foggy that sometimes you couldn't see the bow of the ship from the bridge. When they did bombard Kiska and they finally went in there, they found that the Japanese had left 2 or 3 days before and they were all gone. So there was no need for all that effort that they put in. They came back to the States, and then they got into their big operations of going down to back out to Pearl and got down into Tarawa and invasions down at the Solomon. And I finally came on board the ship then in Eniwetok. And at Eniwetok, that was during the Battle of the Marianas. Then we went over to, when we first got on board ship, I first got on board ship. My first operation was at Saipan and Tinian. We went in there 3 or 4 days ahead of time and bombarded the island and prepared the landing area for the troops to go in. By that time, they had started thinking about what was called a rolling fire. We would heavy bombardment on the beachhead up to H hour, and then at H hour, when the invasion forces were going in, they would raise another 500 yards up to fire in, and you had a constant fire going over the invasion troops. There were some ships who, and I won't mention the names, who missed their raising of their fire line, and I don't know how many Marines were wiped out by friendly fire. But you hear people today talk about friendly fire, and friendly fire has been a bugaboo for the military since the beginning of time, I would suppose. Did I see a hand back there? Oh. After they took Tinian, or after they took Saipan, they went back to take Tinian, and it was at Tinian, we were, like Saipan is here and Tinian's there, so you can be in between them. We were firing at some positions on the island of Tinian when one of their coastal batteries got a good shot at us and hit us right in one of the 5-inch guns. Now, I wish I had the picture. The thing is, 5-inch guns were mounted like this, and there was a soft spot in them. So when you'd raise the gun, here was a soft spot. This was armored on both sides, but the soft spot was not because that's where the gun went up and down, right? Well, we got a 6-inch Japanese right down the soft spot into one of our 5-inch turrets, and I think there was 11 people killed there. And then the next shot that we fired, we wiped out the same gun that hit us. So basically a tit-for-tat thing. One of the men who was in that 5-inch turret still lives here in Feasterville, and I see him occasionally. He's a carpenter, and he's like me. He's 80, and like you, he's 80, and retired, and living a good life as best he can. From Tinian, we went then back to Kwajalein, and from Kwajalein, the next tour was to go down for what they called R&R. We went down to a place called Espiritu Santos. Beautiful little island. But on the way down, we had a problem. The steering mechanism got jammed up, and the Admiral passed the word to pay no attention to Tennessee's motions because her steering mechanism is fouled. And so they worked on that, and they got it back together, and somehow or other they got it back together 180 degrees out of way, and so that it was still fouled. At that time, it was, in wartime, you had reveille an hour before sunrise so that everybody could get to general quarters, just in case at sunrise, if somebody was, some submarines were around, they could get to you. So what happened this morning was, reveille sounded, everybody's getting up to go, we're kind of, okay, gotta get to battle station, and the next thing we hear is clang, 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 stand by for a ram. I thought, what the hell is this? Well, there was such a crash and such a grinding sound, everybody thought we had gone aground, and I have this visual picture in my mind of fannies and floppy shoes and everything else running down the deck, but people were trying to grab their clothes to get to wherever they had to go because we didn't know what was going on. And it was like a Keystone Cops thing. Where's it going?
To the reference desk. Hank to the reference desk. Thank you.
And when we finally found out what happened, we had about 125-foot rip in our starboard bow that went all the way back because the anchor from the California caught it and ripped it back, and then they had it back off like this, and it just sounded, you know, you're in a battleship, man, that sounded awful. I think, wow. But we got down to Espiritu, and there was a floating dry dock down there. They ran the California in the floating dry dock, and they ran the Ajax repair ship alongside of us and cut a big hole out and patched it over. So now our bow is like a little bit off, not so you could notice it, but it was a little bit. If you were steering, you would have a problem. And then we left there, and went back up to get ready to take on provisions and supplies and oil, and reform up to for the invasion of Palo and the Anglo group. We went up there and anchored off of an island called Manus Island in the Admiralty Islands. It was about that far off the equator, and the temperature stayed around 120 day and night. It was just unbearable. And when we were getting ready to leave there, the captain passed the word saying there was 25,000 Japs on that island, but we bypassed them. They have no food, no provisions, no nothing, so we're not going to worry about them. And they left them there. That's one of the things that we did in World War II. Hopscotch past people, cut them off, and just left them there to wither on the end of the line because the Japs couldn't supply them anymore. After we provisioned, then we went up to for the invasion of the Philippines to return Douglas MacArthur to his homeland so he could walk in and say, I have returned. First time he fell going into the beach and he had to go back and change his uniform. The second time is to say, I have returned second time around. That was the beginning of our problem. Hello there.
lose you? I heard something.
Okay, good. I should know how to use one of these things. You know? 40 years in engineering came under me. That was the beginning of our problems with the kamikaze planes because they still had enough aircraft in the Philippines to be harassing. And after the beachhead was secured at Tacloban, we spent a lot of time then making smoke to cover the beachhead so the Japs couldn't get in there with their aircraft. And one evening, I remember this clearly because I was back on the deck. At that time, I smoked cigarettes like everybody else did. I was back on the port side quarterdeck, and out of nowhere, we saw this prow of this ship coming right at us, and there was three of us there. We said, "Oh my God, let's get out of here!" It was the Warhawk, who couldn't see us because
I just got it turned on now.
the smoke and fog we had, and ran into the torpedo, torpedo blister. Hello? On the outside of the ship. And it so happened that it tore up that anti-torpedo blister, which was okay, but that's where they stored all the 3.2 beer. Well, let me tell you, the repair guys and the deck hands, everybody were volunteering to go down there and clean that beer out. There was more empty cans came up than full ones, but they all had a good time down there, and that became one of their big problems. So we cleaned that all up, and they put some patches across that, and then on the 24th of October, all the words were passed that we were going to have to defend the beachhead because the Japanese were sending in 3 fleets. They had split up into 3 sections. And the southern section was to come in down up through Saragossa Strait into the southern end, and that's where we were. And as a radio operator, I spent a lot of time copying messages, and we were then breaking them down and sending them off to the command people. And I remember one clearly said, "The old BBs were expendable." I said, "No, wait a minute, that's us. We are expendable." So when the Jap fleet did come up Saragossa Strait, our Admiral Jesse B. Ollendorf, who was a great guy, had everybody lined up. We had the destroyers and PT boats on both sides, and then the cruisers, and then the battleships. We had crossed it so that the Japs coming up through the straits, had to face us. It's called crossing the T. Well, when you're crossing the T, you can only fire your forward guns, but the T can fire broadside. And that battle started, we started firing at about 20,000 yards because we had the best radar, much better than the Japanese radar was. And it was exactly 13 minutes and 45 seconds from commence firing until, that's it, they were done. It was a great victory for the Americans. It was a great victory for the Navy, and it was the last surface battle between major battleships during the war, and it will probably be the last one that ever occurred ever because all the battleships now are long gone. From that point, this is really ad-libbing. From that point, we then, I guess we left there around the 1st of November. We went back to Pearl Harbor, and we're coming into Pearl Harbor, and they passed the word that there will be an admiral's inspection at 0900 tomorrow morning.
Video.
If you wanted to see guys running around to get their dress shoes out of their sea bags and make sure your stencil, get a haircut. Anybody who could cut hair made a buck that afternoon, let me tell you. Because the next morning, who comes on board? Admiral Nimitz. He inspected the troops, he inspected the ship, he was very laudatory. And then he came down and going down the line, and I heard him down at the end of my group telling one man to step forward. I thought, oh boy, somebody's in trouble. He comes on and had another guy. He came up to me. He says, "Okay, sailor, step forward." I knew my shoes were new. I knew I had clean jeans on. I just had a haircut. I couldn't understand what would have not passed in the inspection.
Let me go get Rick, because I haven't done this in such a long time.
We
He's
secured from the
upstairs.
Admiral's inspection
And you
that
need to get upstairs.
Commander DePiro came back and he said to us, "You three men have to report to sick bay because you don't have a suntan." We just came back, but the radio group was operating one watch in three, so you were either sleeping, eating, or on duty. You didn't have time to get topside to see what was going on, so you had those were your jobs. We went back to Bremerton, and when we got into Bremerton, it was an amazing thing to see. They pulled us into a we went right into the dry dock, and
Rick Guyton, please call extension 28. Rick
In-
Guyton,
in the-
please call extension 28.
next to the dry dock was the whole bow of a ship. And by that afternoon, they had stripped off the front and they were cutting off the bow of our ship, and we were then moved into barracks in the Navy Yard, Bremerton Navy Yard, and watched this whole thing. They lifted the broken bow off and put the other one down and started welding it together. They said we would have there would be a port 30-day leave and a starboard 30-day leave. Well, I pulled the starboard 30-day leave and left to come home right after Christmas. Came home on a coach from Seattle to Harrisburg, sitting up. No place to lay down. So we get that back to Harrisburg, and at that time, a train ticket was a free ticket on the Greyhound bus. So got into Harrisburg, got on a Greyhound bus, went up to Wilkes-Barre. Now, we never had a telephone at our house. In fact, I was 8 years old when we got electricity. So for the first 8 years, we had the outhouse. You got a bath in the laundry tub in the kitchen, and it was that kind of crudeness, I guess. But so when I got into Wilkes-Barre, I still couldn't get home because we didn't have a telephone. So I got a taxi to take me out to a little railroad that was a Wilkes-Barre and Hazleton high-speed electric line.
Which one do you
And I
want?
got home that way. And when I walked in, my mother said, "Well, where have you been?"
One or two?
Because we could never get together. Oh, that looks good. So I'm home, and Buddy is down in Nanticoke. Tut Everett, we called him King Tut. He was a little guy, and he grew a beard, and so everybody naturally was going to call him King Tut. Oh my God, there I am. Yeah, through the miracle of electronics. That's me. I was about 10 years old, and working out in the garden in our backyard. Hmm.
Well,
Well, we lost that in a hurry. So anyhow, I'm home, and I expected to be home for 30 days, and it wasn't that way. 27 days later, I got a phone call to return to the ship immediately. Now can we down the lights a little bit? Can this be cut off here?
yeah, this is all right. Hit the back ones. Hit the back lights.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's the view from my bedroom window. And those are cows there. This was my grandfather's house, and this was a tree in our backyard. But that's where I grew up. Oh, here we go. Can you hit the, okay. That's the Tennessee. And interesting point on the Tennessee that you see there is, it had portholes. And then the bottom down here was the 14-inch armor plating. That was the first ship to have armor plating like that. Click the next one. Yes, that's the Brooklyn Bridge there. This is coming down from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. This ship was built well, actually, it's interesting. The Tennessee's keel was laid, and it was marked California. And the people from California said they wanted their ship built in California, so they changed the name to Tennessee. This is the original poster to get these people to enlist in the crew of the Tennessee. I met one man who was 94 years old who said he had joined the Navy to be a yeoman because he had read all these things about the tough things that the yeomen of the guard did. And he said, they put me in a ship and I found out I was a secretary. But he remembers the crew coming to sign up for their paycheck and making an X. And then their division leader would come along and make his X and say, that's all right. Both of them, neither one of them could write. There's our 1928 champion basketball team. This is what I was telling you about earlier, how well to keep people stimulated, they had all these different programs. These guys were beating everybody on the West Coast. Next. This was the 1935 baseball team. They had won the championship, plus the fact that the pitcher on this team was then drafted by the Detroit Tigers. And there were two brothers on there, Leslie and Lester Manweiler. Lester is still alive, living in Arizona, and I hear from him occasionally. Next. This is the whaleboat crew. These Marines were 1937-38 were the champions, and they got that cup. That's the Brandenburg Cup that was commissioned by a Navy Lord Brandenburg, and the ships would always go in competition with the British ship to see if they could get the Brandenburg Cup, and we retired it in 1938. Next. This is another Marine team who not only got the Brandenburg Cup, they got the Pacific Fleet Cup and the Battle Club and the Olympic Cup and the Seattle Club. They were great. And one of these guys, his name is Dwyer, lives in San Diego, and he sent me all these pictures and all the story. I wanted to know the story because people wanted to know the story on these different cups. The largest one here is the Brandenburg Cup, and he wrote a 2-page letter about that. It was very exciting for me to see that. Next. This man here, his name was Frankie Remus. He finished his Navy career at Johnsville. He was a chief rigger, but here is his belts. He was the Pacific Fleet heavyweight boxing champion, 1929. Do we have the next one there? Yeah, there's the belt. It says 1929 Pacific Fleet champ, and these all went to make points for our future competition for the Ironman. Next. This was a dance that was held September 1938, and you presented the ticket at the door. You could bring your girlfriend. They had nice times during the peacetime Navy. Next, let's see what. Oh, there's the Iron Man trophy and the Iron Man. We had 2 dogs. That one, I guess, left probably in the early 30s, mid 30s, and later on we had another dog called Cinderella, and somebody smuggled her on board, but she wasn't supposed to stay there. Next, there's Cinderella. They rigged up a hammock for her. The XO was gonna bump her off, and when he went down there to say, well, you can't have a dog on, you got to take her off, right? And she looked up at him, and that was the end of that. Next. Okay. This is San Francisco. You see Jordan? Okay, there's Alcatraz, there's Treasure Island, and that's the first pier for the Golden Gate Bridge. The piers you see back here, that's the bridge that's going out to Oakland. That's the Oakland Bay Bridge, which went from San Francisco to Treasure Island, then it went on over to Oakland. And this is the summer fleet going out for maneuvers. That's probably 1935. I think the bridge was finished by 37. Is that true? I don't know. Next. This is Pearl Harbor. I think everybody has seen this. There's an airplane there. I saw a couple others in there when I was looking at it earlier. But there are the battleships lined up there that I told you about. And the first torpedo has exploded on the Oklahoma. Next. Now here you see, this is the West Virginia, which is sunk. This is the main deck of the West Virginia, which should be up there because that's the Tennessee, and she sunk right straight in. The people on the West Virginia did such a great job of counter-flooding the compartments to keep it on an even keel, which is what saved them from being rolled over like the Oklahoma was. You just got to give those guys a tremendous amount of credit for being able to do that. And these were the. I asked the guys what they did here, and they were the crow's nest, and they were range finders. I never did understand how that happened, but I talked to one guy who lived up in there, and he said, well, it was a nice ride because it was always going back and forth. Next, please. Oh, yes. This is the I told you about George Butterball. He had just painted the anchors, and we got down to Anahuac, and our cartoonist Hamp Law was in the first division, and George was really ticked off. Look what they're doing to my new paint job. He just had painted the anchors, and it was here they were being hit by the machine guns from the island. Next. Oh, I forgot about this. All right. Secretary of the Navy, James Forstall, came on board, and he spent some time with us. And we're not going to talk about who this bosun's mate was, but Forstall is up there without a hat on. And he says, I don't care who you are, get a cap on. And apparently he did. And then the bosun's mate found out that was the Secretary Forstall, who spent most of his time up on the flag bridge with a 30-06 shooting at sharks whenever we could find one. But the other thing he did was he always went down the ladder with his hands on the ladder, on the handrails, and people had to shine those up, and they were stainless steel, you polished them, and you oiled them, and you get down the bottom, and it was kind of sticky. That was okay. God, I'm glad this is working. Next. Now we're going back to the Philippines, which I told you about before. But as you can see, this is where the battleships were lined up, and then the cruisers were here, and this is where the Jap fleet came up through here. So we, in the battleship row, could fire all of our shells, all of our guns, at the invading fleet, and they could only fire their forward guns. They didn't get, I don't think they got 10 shots off before it was too late, because we picked them up, I say we picked them up about almost 30,000 yards, but Admiral Ollendorf said, don't fire until you get to 20,000 yards, and that's what they did. Yes?
In our first lecture in October 1997, we talked about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and we covered this. The crossing the T.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a classic maneuver. It was absolutely incredible, and I'm glad that we did it and got away with it, because this was Leyte. This is the area that we were supposed to be protecting, and they were coming up. Next. Oh, okay. This is off the coast of Alaska at Kiska. This is a painting made by a gentleman up in Alaska, and he tried selling this to everybody, and he wanted like $500 a copy for a lithograph, and I thought that was a little steep, so I think we bought one, and I made a photograph of it. And here is, you see down there? That's the beer cans floating. This is where the Warhawk ran to us and peeled open the blister. And we were standing up here. One of those guys may be me. I don't know. I was ready to run. This is Admiral Nimitz came on at Pearl Harbor for an inspection, and you can see in the back there. This is another anchoring point that they had. This was, who was this? This is Captain. Well, that's Ollendorf. Yeah. Next. Now that's what the ship looked like after we got back to Bremerton, and we were told then that we were leaving and we were going out to back out to combat. So what they did was, we're going out the Straits of Juan de Fuca from up there, and they said, well, we're going to do a speed run, and we get up to 21 knots, and that was with everybody pushing. Our old tub wasn't that big. From there, we went back out to, well, we went to Pearl and took on supplies, and then from Pearl went down to Ulithi, and then we came up to invade Iwo Jima. This down here was Mount Suribachi, and you can see this area here was assigned to the Tennessee for its firing cover, and then the Nevada was up here, and the Idaho up here, and the Texas was on the other side, and the Arkansas was over there, and then the cruisers had the upper end. We figured somehow someone had figured that we had to get them out of Mount Suribachi, cut that off, and that's why all the battleships were down there. We were told it was going to be a 10-day operation. That was like a month and a half, I think. February the 19th. And the beachhead here, this whole beachhead is where the Marines went in. And it was solid volcanic sand. And they hit the beachhead and went in up to their knees. They just couldn't get anywhere. They were like sitting ducks there. It was that was a bad situation. Next one. All right, that's Tennessee firing at Mount Suribachi. That's where we were. On the preceding, you saw the area. That was our area of concern. We blasted away at that for a couple of days, and every so often you'd get a shot back, and you'd say, well, we'll shoot there next time. And of course, they weren't there because the inside of that whole volcano was just railroad tracks and caves all around, so they'd shoot here, and then they would move 500 yards down the line, they shoot there, and then they move someplace else, so you couldn't really knock them out. Next. This was the landing at Iwo Jima. That's the Tennessee there. People looked at me and they said, "You got that close to the beachhead?" And I said, "Yeah, well, you know, we didn't stand off 10 miles and shoot at the island. We got within 1,000 yards at least." And these were the landing craft going in with all the troops. At Iwo Jima, wounded were brought back to us because we were closer than anybody else, and then the ones we could treat, we treated, and the ones we couldn't treat, we got them transferred then to a hospital ship. And this operation of the wounded being taken care of, we had our own people who were getting wounded on board the ship too. And can I have one light, please? Yeah.
I think the master switch has cut them off back here. Let me try to get
Oh. Well, there, that's it. Good. Never mind. I have to do this. My friend Ed Curley, who was a seaman second class, and he was up on the decks. He writes this. He sent me this. He said, on February the 17th, 1945, during the battle for the island of Iwo Jima, my ship, the Tennessee, was fired on by enemy shore battery, and a comrade was wounded by shrapnel serving his jugular vein. I found him where he had been placed on the deck and stayed with him until he died. As I kneeled by him trying to comfort him, I realized he was in shock and probably did not comprehend my concern for him. At that point, my thoughts turned to his mother and the agony she would suffer if she knew at this moment that her son were dying here on the deck. It was then I tried to say a short prayer. And as I prayed for him and his mother, my thoughts turned to my own mother and her distress were I who lay here dying. So I said in the end a prayer for him and for me in case I had no time to say it if I were to be taken later on. And this is what he prayed. "O peace so quiet, surround this body still, whose spirit is now in flight to God's own open door. Lord, take him to your bosom, warm, and put him in your highest mansion. No less for him than that you promised me. Forgive his sins and lay his hand upon his mother's heart, that all her grief will not be more than she can bear. And as we commit his body to the deep, I pray these things for me, should of the battle's rage it be so willed that I should join him there. In Jesus' name I pray, amen." He said, "This was my first experience with the shipboard fatality, and I wrote the words down soon after and carried them until I received my papers that I was out. That was many years ago, but I think the words are still true today. Signed, E.K." Ed was a nice guy. He was a Tennessee boy, grew up in the mountains of Tennessee, and he had a knack for writing. He sent me another poem that tells you what kind of a guy he was. He says, "This is the young breadwinner. Down the hillside to the branch, breeches legs rolled over up the knees, water's low, so in I go. We'll have crayfish for supper, if you please. Down to the hillside to the branch, breeches legs rolled up to the knees, the water's low, so in I go. I'll catch those crayfish if they don't catch me. Down to the hillside, across the meadow, to catch a rabbit in the dell. Rabbits don't have those doggone pinchers, and I like rabbits just as well." He was a great guy. He lives down in Houston, and I hear from him quite regularly. But this picture tells you what turned Ed into a serious poet, and it always gets to me when I see it because I know what it was like. Next. After Iwo Jima, we went back to Ulithi and we took on supplies and made up with the fleet again, and this was D-Day, Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945. We were bombarding Okinawa, and they called it L Hour, was the invasion day, invasion time. If you look very carefully, you can see the 3 shells right there that we just fired, and these were the troops going in their landing craft. By that time, I had a new job. I was no longer in the radio. What was I? I was still a radio, but I was no longer in the radio shack for my battle station. My battle station now was in the gun pointing room, and so I was in communications with the people on the beach. I talked with the flyers who were flying air cover, or I talked with the forward observers who told us where to fire, and I probably killed as many as anybody else because I was firing broadside 5-inch 38s, and there was 2, 4, 6, 8 on the starboard side, 8 on the port side, and I had 2 triggers. And when they would tell me when to fire, I would just fire, and then the spotter would say, okay, up 5 or left 5 or whatever, and I'd fire another round in there, and he'd say, okay, let's have 10 rounds there. So as fast as they could load them up, I fired 10 rounds. That was, actually, it was very easy for me, but I don't know about the guys on the beach. I used to listen to them. I could hear gunfire going off from the forward observers, and I'd say, what are you doing? He said, well, we're about 100 yards back from the fire from the line. I thought, oh, God, not for me. Next. Now, everybody knows that the kamikazes were a horrendous problem at Okinawa. And this picture was taken April the 12th. We had just splashed one there. There was another one splashed off there, and you can see all the anti-aircraft fire. And this is, again, George, this is where your proximity fuses came in, because we had 6 kamikazes coming in on our port side. They shot down 5 of them with 5-inch 38s with the proximity fuses. The one that got away circled around and came up this way and came down and slashed down our starboard side, and I think it was 119 people were killed. But that was a scary day. That was a scary day. The kamikazes were horrendous. Next. Okay, now you see the firefighters now are spraying water on the damaged area. The plane had a 250-pound bomb. It blew a hole through the deck, and then it exploded down below, and there was quite a few people got killed down there. This is the Zellers. The Zellers got hit at the same time. That was a destroyer, one of the Pickett destroyers. The Fleet Command had placed all these destroyers around the perimeter, and they were to be the first people that the Japanese kamikazes would see, and they took a beating. Next. Okay, this is the damage. This is a 5-inch 38. It's a gun sticking out here, ripped off the top. This is a 20-millimeter gun bucket. Here's another one down here. Next. There's a 40-millimeter gun bucket there and a pointer. This is the debris that's on the deck. One of the guys that was in this gun bucket, a guy named Harry Neal, was burned over about 80% of his body, and we thought, nobody expected him to live. He's now retired. He was a farmer out in Indiana. He comes to every reunion. His face is pretty badly scarred, but he's still alive and a heck of a nice guy. At the same time when this got hit here, Boyd Shea, who was a radio tech, was hit and almost lost his life. One of the deckhands found him and saw that he was bleeding from his armpit, So the deckhand took his wristwatch, or took his pocket watch and jammed up there and held it down, and they got him. So Boyd went back home and grew 40 acres of red raspberries. And Shirley said, if I ever have to pick another raspberry, I'm going to scream. But they had, the Mexicans would come up for harvesting. And the other man who was a storekeeper who was injured in this, that I know personally, was the guy named Burgess, Tom Burgess, who lost a leg and was sent back to Philadelphia Navy Hospital for rehabilitation, and then went back home to Chicago and became CEO of one of the biggest printing companies in Chicago until he passed away a few years ago. Next. This is another shot of the damage here from, he clipped off all these things up on the top. This is a radar screen there. And up here was the bridge. The wingtip had nicked the bridge. Next. Oh, yeah. At Okinawa, when we were getting ready to leave, we took on some Marines who had a hard time figuring out how you're going to dig a foxhole there in the deck, because they didn't know how you could dig in and get away from the kamikazes. This guy, Hamp Law, I just got a letter from him the other day. He lives in West Monroe, Louisiana. He did cartoons for Chilton Publications for about 40 years. Next. This is a painting. We had a Lieutenant Draper come on board during the Marianas, and he painted a number of pictures that I finally found one time in a National Geographic magazine, and I got in touch with him and asked him where could I find these pictures, and I finally traced them down to the Naval Arts Center, Combat Arts Center at Washington, D.C. And then I was working at KYW, and I looked into the funny phone book that we had, and I found out there was a Draper, William F. Draper in New York, and I called, and he answered the phone. And I identified myself and told him what I wanted. He said, yeah, they used those, and they never gave me a nickel. But later on, in looking up in Who's Who, I found that Draper printed 2 murals in Bancroft Hall at the Academy. So he's a pretty famous painter. Next. Oh, now we went up to a place called Wakayama 1, and which was where we were scheduled to take the invasion forces in. And this was the contingent from the Osaka Naval District that was coming out to the ship to surrender. Next. This is Commander Dawes, who's greeting them. He was the Admiral Ollendorf's second, and they came on board, and they didn't look too formidable to us. We kind of looked at them and said, wow, how about that? Next. This is Admiral Ollendorf, this is Commander Dawes, and these were the surrender people. Translation, quit. Now we had a chance. Okay, go ahead. Now they told us we're going back to the States. We said, oh, wow, how are we going back to the States? We couldn't get through the Panama Canal, and we didn't want to go around through the Straits of Magellan. So there was our trip. We're going from Tokioka to Wakayama to Singapore to Colombo, Cape Town, and Philadelphia. And that was great. Next. In Tokyo, October the 1st, we had a happy hour. Ships at those times had happy hours. You had boxing matches and entertainment and singing and dancing and all that stuff. And that was I guess that was the last happy hour we had. And we would print out these programs and hand them out. Different people would do different things. Next. This was our route home. From Tokyo down to Singapore, up to Colombo, Cape Town, and then the long haul back to Philadelphia. We were originally supposed to stop at Rio de Janeiro, but they were having national elections. They sent us right straight through to Philadelphia. From Cape Town to Philadelphia is a lot of water. Next. Oh, yes, this is another happy hour we had on the 20th of May in 45. And it so happens that the 20th of May is when I married my high school bride, but it was 1950. Next. Okay. I forgot about this one. This guy here, his name is Leon P. Graves. He was a seaman. This is Dick Dysart. He was from Altoona, and that's me. And we got back to the States. We got back here, and we said VEJ Day was celebrated all over the country, and VE Day was celebrated all over the country. So this picture was taken December the 11th, 1945, in Philadelphia, and we're all pretty more than 3 sheets to the wind. Great guys. One more, or is there? That's the end. This is Joe Duffin, who lives in Vernon, Connecticut, and his now wife, there was a girlfriend at the time, Betty. She came down from Easton to meet the ship, and I found this picture in the newspaper, and I thought, that's an appropriate end for my talk.
Right? Oh, we've got 15 minutes or so.
All right, we're going to use the same procedure we've done before. If you have a question, you raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone, and we want a question. We don't want, a bibliography because everybody else won't get a chance.
We've got some lights over there, Bob.
One question.
Okay, notice on the crew was all white. Were you in the Navy at all when it finally became integrated? And did you have any thoughts about that?
We had stewards. The stewards were all black, and in fact, the steward's living compartment was right next to the radio operator's living compartment. We went back and forth to us all the time. A lot of those were colored, and a lot of them were Filipino. Yeah.
All right. I'll save the other question.
What was a wartime compliment?
Wartime compliment was about 2,800.
What class were you? First, second, or third?
I was a radio operator third. Third?
Over here. Oh,
Just
Alan?
make a comment, George.
Yes, you will.
Bud, I want to thank you for the manner in which you recreated a time and place. And I got that sense of we. It was very important, and the U.S. Navy was very lucky having you. Thank you so much.
But I'd just like to tell you that when you passed from Santa Fuca into the Puget Sound, you got an okay from the 14th Coast Artillery.
Oh, yes.
And I saw your ship when it came in.
Anybody over here?
I was going to ask you, what was the name of the person that you were with, you said was from Feasterville?
His name was Don Westerner. And he was a carpenter. And I haven't talked to him lately. I think he was having some problems, but I guess it maybe 6 months since I talked to him.
I just wondered if I might know him. I live in Feasterville.
Let's look him up.
Thank you. Yeah.
Tell him you heard his name. Anybody over here? You've had another one, sir?
Yes. This is a tough one. I want to phrase it the right way because we can't thank you enough for what you did. Fate intervened a lot in your career in the Navy. Could you expand on it? Any thoughts about some of the other ships and how you felt about it?
The question is, fate intervened a lot. In my own personal experience, I went to boot camp. We were finished with boot camp, and they said, "Does anybody here know Morse code?" Well, I was a first-class Boy Scout. I knew Morse code. Radio school. Which that's simple. I went to radio school. I did the whole shtick with the radio thing. I did communications and everything. I came back home, and you know, the 5220 club or whatever it was, you could go to work or whatever. So I got a job driving a truck and decided, man, this is work. So I thought the only thing I really knew was communications. I went to Philadelphia Wireless. I got my license. I became a broadcaster. And for the rest of my career, I was in hog heaven broadcast. Only because when I was 12 years old, I learned the Morse code, and the Navy sent me to communications school. Yes?
Remember the name of the guy at the school? Van Horn?
Sam Horn. I remember Bill Zerfing.
Van Horn.
Van Horn, yeah. He owned it, he ran the thing. Bill Zerfing was one of the better
I went there
teachers.
for 6 months before I enlisted to learn the code more.
I thought Zerf was a great teacher there. And when I got there, they had this old chief who was going to teach us how to do code. So he's sending it, I'm writing it down, and he looks at me and said, "How do you know this?" I said, "Oh, well, then you get up here and send it." But I did that too.
1533 Pine Street.
Right. Yeah, it's still there.
Big brass plaque down there. Now they've
And-
changed something else too, like air conditioning.
You know what I found out? I tried to get into Drexel after I came back down
Did
here.
that too.
And I couldn't get in there. And I met a young, a young Jewish lad who said, "There's a radio school down here on Pine Street. Let's go down there." And then we found out that it was the oldest radio institution in America.
And if you got a ticket there, you could go anywhere in the country and be a maintenance man.
Oh yeah, because when I took over, then eventually I became the engineering supervisor at KYW, and I had 3 guys who went to Philadelphia Wireless who were working for me.
Well, look what happened to me.
Yeah, shame on you.
I put the first radio station on the air from New Caledonia after Pearl Harbor, about 60 days, and we said, "We are here."
That's interesting.
An old transmitter that we pulled out of a building in Noumea that Pan American had closed up,
Mm-hmm.
had no crystals,
Mm-hmm.
so I made an MOPA circuit, got it on the air, and it chirped like crazy, but they could read it.
Do you remember hearing those signals that on board ship you would hear we did CW communications and voice communication, and sometimes you'd hear you get a signal coming in and go chip 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 chip. And I was receiving one of these one day, and the chief came along, Chief Kaplan, and he said, "Let me have your key." I flipped it over, and he sat down there, and he sent them 3 of the sloppiest Z's I ever heard. Da, 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 da. I said, "What's that?" He said, "Now, careful, this is what he said. This is a quote." He said, "That means you got bird shit on your antenna."
Do you remember what daw daw diddy daw daw was?
Oh, diddy-da-da.
You son of a bitch.
Yes.
Uncover
I got to turn it over to George, to my friend George, who really got me in trouble here.
It's just the way I get.
Any other questions other than Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or what have you? Bud, listen, let me tell you, you delivered as you said you would, and we apologize for the delay and any confusion and that increased pulse rate that you had, you know, that I heard it from where I was sitting, so it's all right. It's back to normal. Listen, thank you all for coming. Look forward to seeing you next month. And Jack, did you hear me talk about you're going to Russia and everything earlier? Okay, good. That's Jack Agnew. And Jack, we're going to wait for that report that you give us when you get back. Thanks for coming. We'll see you again next month.